The Vietnam War remains one of the most polarizing and influential conflicts in modern history. Lasting from 1955 to 1975, this protracted war not only left deep scars on the Vietnamese people and landscape but also forever altered the political and social dynamics of countries involved, particularly the United States. From anti-war protests to societal upheaval, the Vietnam War shook America to its core and forever changed the way its citizens viewed their government and military. In this video, we will delve into the complexities of this notorious conflict, exploring its origins, major events, and its enduring impact on the generation that lived through it. The Vietnam War was more than a distant battleground, it was a conflict that seeped into every aspect of American society. As the first televised war, it brought the horrors of combat directly into living rooms across the nation, forcing a reckoning with the true costs of war. The anti-war movement gained momentum as young protesters took to the streets, expressing their fierce opposition to what they viewed as an unjust and senseless war. Meanwhile, the government's handling of the war, marred by deception and miscommunication, shattered the public's trust and resulted in lasting political consequences. Ultimately, the Vietnam War shaped an entire generation, leaving an indelible mark on their worldview and forever changing the way America approaches military interventions. Historical background of the Vietnam War. Causes and reasons behind the conflict. Key events and turning points during the war. Impact of the Vietnam War on soldiers and civilians. Legacy and lessons learned from the Vietnam War. Historical background of the Vietnam War. Historical background of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, a conflict that spanned over 2 decades, is often regarded as one of the most controversial and divisive episodes in American history. It was not only a war fought on foreign soil but also an ideological battleground that profoundly shaped a generation. To understand the complexity and significance of this war, it is important to delve into its historical background. The roots of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the 19th century when Vietnam was colonized by the French. The French established their presence in Southeast Asia and sought to exploit Vietnam's resources, primarily through the rubber and rice industries. However, the Vietnamese people longed for independence and began resisting French rule. In the mid-20th century, during the height of the Cold War, Vietnam became a pawn in the global struggle between communism and capitalism. The division of Vietnam into the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-Communist South, supported by the United States, set the stage for a conflict that would have far-reaching consequences. The first direct involvement of the United States in Vietnam came in the early 1950s when it provided military assistance to the French. However, despite American support, the French were defeated at the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This defeat marked a turning point in the conflict and led to the Geneva Accords, which divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel and called for national elections to reunify the country. The United States, apprehensive about the prospect of a communist-dominated Vietnam, prevented the elections from taking place, fearing that they would result in a victory for Ho Chi Minh. Instead, the U.S. supported the establishment of an anti-communist government in South Vietnam under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem. This marked the beginning of an increasingly protracted and brutal conflict that would engulf the entire region. As the war escalated, the United States gradually increased its military involvement in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where U.S. naval vessels were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese boats, provided the justification for a significant escalation in U.S. military activities. In response to the incident, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Lyndon B. Johnson to take any measures necessary to repel further aggression. The American strategy in Vietnam centered around the idea of attrition, aiming to wear down the enemy through a relentless campaign of bombing and ground offensives. The United States believed that it could defeat the North Vietnamese and their guerrilla fighters, known as the Viet Cong, with their superior firepower. However, the conflict proved to be far more challenging than anticipated, and the U.S. faced significant opposition from both the enemy and its own population at home. Public opinion in the United States gradually turned against the war, with growing opposition and protests against the government's policies. The anti-war movement gained momentum, fueled by the high casualty rates and the belief that the war was a futile and unjust endeavor. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a coordinated series of surprise attacks by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on multiple cities and military installations, further eroded public support for the war. Finally, in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. However, fighting continued between North and South Vietnam, ultimately resulting in the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, in 1975. The country was subsequently reunified under communist rule. Causes and reasons behind the conflict. The causes and reasons behind the Vietnam War are complex and multifaceted, rooted in a combination of historical, political, and ideological factors. Understanding these factors is crucial to unraveling the controversial conflict that shaped a generation. One of the primary causes of the Vietnam War was the long-standing struggle for Vietnamese independence from foreign domination. In the late 19th century, France colonized Vietnam, ruling it as part of French Indochina. Over the decades, Vietnamese nationalist movements emerged, seeking to liberate their country from colonial rule. Most notably, the Communist Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought against the French during the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. When the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, it marked a turning point in Vietnamese history and set the stage for future conflicts. The Cold War context played a significant role in the escalation of the Vietnam War. As communist ideology spread throughout the world, the United States feared a domino effect, whereby one country falling to communism would lead to others following suit. This was known as the containment policy. Thus, the United States, driven by the fear of communism, provided military, financial, and logistical support to the South Vietnamese government in its fight against the Communist Viet Cong insurgency. By doing so, the United States became deeply involved in the conflict, ultimately escalating it to a full-scale war. Furthermore, the ideological divide between communism and capitalism exacerbated tensions. The North Vietnamese regime, under Ho Chi Minh, aligned itself with the Soviet Union and China, both communist powers. On the other hand, the South Vietnamese government, with the support of the United States, embraced capitalism and aimed to defend its non-communist way of life. The clash of ideologies added fuel to the fire and transformed the Vietnam War into a proxy war between the superpowers. Another cause of the conflict was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. In August 1964, there were reports of North Vietnamese aggression against American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. This incident served as a catalyst for the United States to significantly escalate its military involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson broad powers to prosecute the war. However, subsequent investigations have raised doubts about the accuracy and justification of the initial reports, suggesting that the incident may have been exaggerated or even fabricated. Lastly, the domestic politics of both the United States and Vietnam also played a crucial role in the war's escalation. In the United States, intense political divisions emerged, with dissent and protests growing among the American public who questioned the necessity and morality of the war. In Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government faced widespread corruption, weak leadership, and a lack of popular support, further hindering its ability to effectively counter the communist insurgency. In conclusion, the causes and reasons behind the Vietnam War were influenced by historical, political, and ideological factors. The struggle for Vietnamese independence, the Cold War context, the ideological clash between communism and capitalism, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and domestic politics all played a significant role in shaping the conflict. Understanding these intricacies is vital to comprehending the complexity of the Vietnam War and its lasting impact on those directly involved in the generations that followed. Key events and turning points during the war. Key events and turning points during the war. The Vietnam War was a complex and protracted conflict that spanned over 2 decades. It was a unique and highly debated war, leaving an indelible mark on both the United States and Vietnam. Throughout the course of the war, several key events and turning points occurred that significantly influenced its outcome and shaped the perspectives of an entire generation. One of the first major turning points of the Vietnam War was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. It involved reports of North Vietnamese attacks against American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, leading the U.S. to retaliate with airstrikes and Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This incident marked a significant increase in U.S. involvement in the war, as it provided a legal framework for expanded military action in Vietnam. However, it later came to light that the initial reports of North Vietnamese attacks were exaggerated, raising questions about the legitimacy of the U.S. response. Another crucial event was the Tet Offensive of 1968. The Tet Offensive was a surprise attack by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces on several South Vietnamese cities during the Vietnamese New Year, known as Tet. It was a clear demonstration that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong still possessed considerable strength and determination. The ferocity and scale of the offensive shocked many in the U.S., who had been led to believe that the war was nearing its end. The Tet Offensive undermined public confidence in the U.S. government's handling of the war and sparked widespread anti-war sentiment. In 1970, the invasion of Cambodia by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces served as another turning point in the war. President Richard Nixon justified the incursion as an effort to disrupt North Vietnamese supply routes and sanctuaries in Cambodia. However, the invasion sparked intense protests across the United States, fueling further anti-war sentiments. It also marked a significant expansion of the war in Southeast Asia and escalated tensions both domestically and internationally. The Paris Peace Accord signed in 1973 marked a crucial turning point in the war. These accords aimed to achieve a peaceful settlement and set conditions for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. Under the agreement, the U.S., North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong agreed to a ceasefire and a release of prisoners of war. The Paris Peace Accord signaled a de facto recognition by the U.S. that its goals in Vietnam were unattainable through military means alone. It acted as a prelude to the ultimate withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam, leaving the South Vietnamese to fight their own battles. Perhaps the most poignant turning point in the war was the fall of Saigon in 1975. After years of fighting, the North Vietnamese forces successfully captured the South Vietnamese capital, reuniting Vietnam under communist rule. The fall of Saigon symbolized the failure of U.S. military intervention and a significant blow to America's global prestige. It also led to a mass exodus of South Vietnamese refugees, many of whom faced persecution under the new regime. In conclusion, the Vietnam War was marked by numerous key events and turning points that left an enduring impact. From the Gulf of Tonkin incident to the Tet Offensive, the invasion of Cambodia to the Paris Peace Accords, and ultimately, the fall of Saigon, each event shaped the trajectory of the war, influenced public opinion, and ultimately led to the eventual withdrawal of U.S. forces. The Vietnam War was a tumultuous period in history that forever changed the lives of those involved and sparked ongoing debates about the nature of impact of the Vietnam War on soldiers and civilians. The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history, and its far-reaching impact on soldiers and civilians alike cannot be understated. Lasting from 1955 to 1975, the war cast a dark shadow that shaped a generation and left an indelible mark on the lives of those involved. For soldiers, the Vietnam War was an experience unlike any other. Many young men, primarily from working-class backgrounds, were drafted into service against their will. They found themselves thrust into a brutal and unforgiving environment, facing the harsh realities of combat in unfamiliar and hostile territory. Physically, the war took a toll on the soldiers. The humid jungles, swamps, and rugged terrain of Vietnam posed significant challenges and obstacles. The constant threat of enemy ambushes, booby traps, and guerrilla warfare tactics added to the already unbearable stress. Soldiers endured long periods of extreme physical exertion, malnutrition, and exposure to diseases like malaria. The trauma of witnessing the horrors of war, losing comrades, and being involved in acts of violence also left a deep emotional scar on these young men. Moreover, soldiers returning from Vietnam faced a society that was deeply divided over the war. They were met with hostility and opposition, labeled as baby killers and blamed for a war that many considered unjust and futile. This rejection and lack of support further exacerbated the emotional wounds already inflicted by their wartime experiences. Many soldiers struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, yet few resources were available to help them cope with the psychological aftermath of the war. The impact of the Vietnam War was not limited to soldiers alone, it rippled through civilian communities as well. In Vietnam, civilians faced extreme hardships and dislocation. The conflict devastated rural villages and resulted in the displacement of thousands of people. Families were uprooted from their ancestral homes, and farmers could no longer tend to their lands due to the destruction caused by bombings and chemical warfare. The war left behind a landscape scarred by defoliation and contaminated by Agent Orange, causing long-term health problems for generations to come. On the home front, the war fueled a growing anti-war movement and divided the nation like never before. Families were torn apart as the younger generation protested against their own government's involvement in Vietnam, while older generations clung to the belief that they were fighting for a noble cause. The war deeply polarized American society, igniting protests, marches, and acts of civil disobedience. The scars of this divide can still be seen today, as the Vietnam War planted the seeds for ongoing skepticism toward military actions and a sense of wariness regarding government decisions. Ultimately, the Vietnam War left an enduring impact on soldiers and civilians, both domestically and internationally. Its legacy is one of suffering, trauma, and shattered lives. The war changed the way wars are fought, the way political decisions are made, and the way society views war veterans. It shaped a generation by instilling a sense of skepticism, disillusionment, and the importance of questioning authority. The Vietnam War served as a harsh wake-up call, forever etching its place in history as a stark reminder of the permanent scars that warfare inflicts on soldiers and civilians alike. Legacy and lessons learned from the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a tumultuous conflict that not only shook the foundations of a nation but also left a lasting impact on the generation that lived through it. As the dust settled and the war came to an end, its legacy and the lessons learned from it became evident. This article delves into the profound impact the Vietnam War had on various aspects of society and explores the valuable lessons that emerged from this controversial conflict. One of the most significant legacies of the Vietnam War was the loss of faith in the government and its institutions. The war was marred by reports of government deception, such as the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident, which eroded public trust. The realization that the government had misled the American people led to a widespread suspicion of political leaders and a deep cynicism towards the government. Moreover, the Vietnam War brought to light the horrors of war and created a lasting disillusionment with armed conflict. The graphic images and stories from the war circulated through the media, bringing the brutality and suffering of warfare directly into American living rooms. This newfound awareness paved the way for a strong anti-war movement and a lasting desire for peace. The war also highlighted the power of collective action and social movements. The Vietnam War era witnessed an unprecedented level of public protest and activism against the war. From massive protests to acts of civil disobedience, individuals across the nation came together to express their opposition to the conflict. The strength and fervor of these social movements demonstrated the potential for citizens to influence government policies and shape the course of history. Another legacy of the Vietnam War was the impact on veterans and their communities. Unlike previous wars, the Vietnam War saw an immense social divide between those who served and those who did not. Veterans returning home faced hostility and were often met with public condemnation rather than gratitude. The harsh treatment of Vietnam veterans led to a re-evaluation of how the nation treats its servicemen and women, ultimately leading to the establishment of better support systems and services for veterans. Furthermore, the Vietnam War highlighted the need for a more cautious approach to military intervention. The conflict in Vietnam demonstrated the limitations of military might and the dangers of entering into wars without a clear strategy or exit plan. It taught the world a valuable lesson about the importance of fully understanding the complexities and consequences of engaging in armed conflict. The Vietnam War became a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked military adventurism and exerted a profound influence on subsequent decisions about military intervention. In conclusion, the Vietnam War left a lasting legacy on American society and individuals that lived through it. From the erosion of public trust in the government to the lasting impact on veterans and their communities, the war's repercussions were far-reaching. Importantly, it also taught valuable lessons about the dangers of blind obedience, the power of collective action, and the need for a cautious approach to military intervention. The Vietnam War will forever be remembered as a pivotal moment in history that shaped a generation and continues to influence our understanding of war and its consequences. In conclusion, the Vietnam War was a deeply complex and controversial conflict that left a profound impact on an entire generation. From the ideological clash between communism and capitalism, to the role of the media in shaping public perception, the war challenged the values and beliefs of the American people. It exposed the horrifying realities of war and ignited passionate debates about foreign policy, government transparency, and the responsibilities of a democracy. The Vietnam War divided families, communities, and the nation as a whole, leaving scars that endure to this day. It served as a painful lesson that war should never be taken lightly, and that the consequences of our actions extend far beyond the battlefield. As we reflect on this tumultuous time in history, let us remember the sacrifices made by those who served and continue to strive for peace, understanding, and the pursuit of a better world for future generations. Please like and subscribe the channel if you find the right information.